Picture the scene. Madrid, November 28, 1657. The Alcazar Palace lies wrapped in a shroud of silence, broken only by the toll of evening bells and the hurried footsteps of servants huddled in shadowed passageways. Inside, a queen has given birth at last, and the crimson stains on silks and linen mark both triumph and cost for a dynasty clinging to survival. In the hands of the midwife rests a newborn boy, his skin pale from the strain of entering the world, his limbs thin and trembling from the effort of breathing. To the courtiers gathered around, he is not merely another royal infant, he is salvation, a long-awaited prince and a lineage plagued by death. History will remember him as Felipe Prospero, the fragile child who, for a few fleeting years, carried the hopes of the Spanish Empire on his unsteady shoulders. His blood is a map of ancestry twisted by generations of strategic intermarriage, a latticework of unions so closely bound that the consequences are written on his body before he can even cry. His father, Philip IV of Spain, had already buried too many children. His mother, Mariana of Austria, was niece to her own husband and the embodiment of the Habsburg obsession with purity. The child, now taking his first breath, was therefore more than a prince, he was the latest result of a genetic experiment centuries in the making. A living vessel for a dynasty determined to preserve its power at the cost of its own vitality. His chest rose unevenly. His skull seemed soft in places where bone should have joined firmly. His face already carried the unmistakable watermark of his family, the beginning of that heavy Habsburg jaw. This was no ordinary birth, it was the continuation of a pattern that had shaped European politics for generations. For centuries, the ruling houses of Austria and Spain had pursued an unyielding principle: preserve territory by preserving blood. While other monarchies forged alliances by marrying into distant courts, the Habsburgs turned inward. They married cousins, nieces, uncles, reinforcing bonds so rigid that the family line narrowed into a funnel. Each new generation was another turn of the same closed loop, tightening the genetic noose little by little. Philip II of Spain had married his niece Anna of Austria. Their son Philip III married his cousin Margaret. In turn, Philip IV married Mariana, his own niece. The pattern was deliberate, each marriage a political calculation meant to isolate the dynasty from foreign influence. The cost was paid in cradles and coffins. Too many infants were born frail, malformed, or unable to survive their first years. Too many were recorded as victims of natural causes, though the truth lurked in their bloodlines. For a brief moment, none of this mattered. The midwife raised the infant prince, and the courtiers bowed. To them, this trembling boy was proof that God had not abandoned Spain. But to modernize, the scene reveals something darker. The portraits cleaned and preserved today show the telltale signs: elongated faces, drooping eyelids, protruding jaws, bodies weakened by centuries of biological repetition. Even in the dim chamber of his birth, Philip Prospero embodied both promise and threat, a flicker of survival for a dynasty nearing collapse, and a living reminder that the price of purity was written in fragile bone and trembling breath. As Philip Prospero grew in the nurseries of the Alcazar, his world was shaped not by toys or laughter, but by rituals designed to keep him alive. Physicians hovered over him like sentinels, measuring fevers, weighing fragments of food refused, noting each tremor of his hands. Nurses carried him wrapped in layers of embroidered cloth, not for warmth alone, but to support limbs too weak to bear their own weight. Within those same corridors, the memory of siblings lost far too early lingered like drafts through cracked windows. Before Philip's birth, hope had risen and collapsed over and over. Sons and daughters of Philip IV had gasped once, then vanished. Infants had been baptized only to be buried days later. Those within the court understood what the chroniclers would dare not write. The dynasty was unraveling from within, undone by the very strategy meant to guarantee its immortality. Philip of Austria, though cherished, bore visible signs of the inheritance his family refused to abandon. His skin was translucent, his bones delicate, his gaze often distant, as if pulled away by invisible threads. Yet artists summoned to depict him softened every feature. In their canvases, he appeared radiant, solemn, princely, an image crafted more for Europe's courts than for truth. These portraits circulated as visual propaganda, reaffirming Spain's legitimacy. They denied the tremors, minimized the frailty, and erased the reality visible to anyone who stood near his cradle. His childhood unfolded under the weight of both expectation and terror. Courtiers tiptoed around him, speaking in hushed voices, as though loud sound might shatter him. Confessors sprinkled holy water at the threshold of his rooms, believing that divine grace alone kept him breathing. Relics of saints hung above his bed, wood splinters, bone fragments, and faded scraps of linen said to heal the weak. Each object reflected desperation, disguised as piety. Beyond superstition lay strategy. Philip was heir to an empire that spanned continents. His survival meant political stability in a kingdom strained by war, famine, and failing finances. Ministers watched him as generals watched supply lines, calculating each day he lived as another day of postponed disaster. His body was fragile, but his symbolic weight was immense. A single breath carried the hopes of armies, bishops, governors, and colonists scattered across oceans. In those early years, he seldom left the inner chambers of the palace. Sunlight was considered dangerous, breezes potentially lethal. He was raised in controlled air among tapestries depicting battles he would never fight and ancestors whose vigor he could never match. His mother, Queen Mariana, visited him often, her presence both loving and anxious. She hovered between maternal tenderness and political dread, knowing that every cough could become a crisis. As he grew old enough to sit upright, Philip's physical weaknesses became harder to conceal. His head, slightly enlarged, tipped forward on a neck that strained under its weight. His hands trembled when he tried to hold objects. Moments of clarity and charm alternated with spells of fatigue that left him motionless for hours. Physicians described these symptoms in polite euphemisms, crafting reports that reassured the king while masking the truth. They wrote of delicate humors, of slow but steady growth, of temperament requiring careful observation. Behind closed doors, they debated fevers that refused to break, seizures that left him limp for hours, and developmental delays too severe to ignore. Yet for all his frailty, Philip of Austria became a beacon of hope in the eyes of his father, Philip IV. The king, worn from grief and burdened by a declining empire, clung to his son's survival as evidence that divine favor still lingered over Spain. He ordered celebrations for each of the boys' birthdays, no matter how modest. He commissioned new portraits that depicted the prince surrounded by symbols of virtue and strength. He believed, because he had to, that this child would grow into a king capable of restoring glory, but reality seeped through the cracks of ceremony. In the palace corridors, whispers spread of the prince's frequent illnesses. Rumors carried news of nights spent in prayer, of physicians summoned in haste, of sudden fevers that left the court breathless with fear. Each crisis fed the growing anxiety that the dynasty's future hung by the thinnest thread. Still, the Spanish court tried to project confidence. Foreign ambassadors wrote home, describing Philip as intelligent, observant, even charming. They noted his affectionate nature, his gentle way of reaching for familiar faces, his curiosity about objects placed before him. These glimpses of vitality gave Europe reason to believe that Spain's heir might yet live long enough to inherit the crown. But every moment of promise was shadowed by fragility. Philip walked later than other children, spoke with difficulty, and tired easily. When he laughed, it was a soft, fleeting sound, often followed by coughing fits that terrified his caregivers. Meals were small victories. Sleep was a fragile truce between his body and its invisible battles. The empire held its breath with him day after day. By the time Philip reached the age of 3, his condition had become the unspoken axis around which the entire court revolved. Physicians disputed treatments, nobles speculated in guarded tones, and diplomats watched for signs that Spain's stability might soon crack. Each symptom became a political event. And yet one truth remained. Philip of Austria was a child, a small, fragile boy who clung to life with a tenacity that defied his lineage. His existence was both miracle and caution, a bright flame flickering against the winds blowing through a decaying dynasty. Philip could offer only a heartbeat, precious, weak, and uncertain. The snow that fell on Madrid in those early years settled over rooftops and battlements without regard for destiny. The city had seen many births and deaths within its palaces, but with Philip's life, history felt suspended, as though the future of an empire weighed upon a cradle too fragile to bear it. By the time Philip of Austria reached the age of 4, the machinery of dynastic politics had already placed its full weight upon him. The Spanish court, stiff with ceremonial expectations, regarded the boy not as a child, but as the axis upon which the monarchy's future turned. They looked to the fragile prince and saw not a person, but a possibility, one that could vanish with a single fever. His nurses dressed him in brocades that shimmered under candlelight, clothing meant for heirs who could stand tall beneath the weight of empire. Yet his limbs trembled when lifted, and his body sagged in the arms of attendants. Even so, he was paraded before the court on rare occasions, borne carefully on cushions, his face pale beneath a cloud of lace. Each appearance was orchestrated to reassure Spain, and perhaps God himself, that the dynasty still had a future. Couriers bowed deeply as Philip passed, offering blessings for his continued health, but behind their reverent expressions lurked anxiety. Too many heirs had died before him. The fear was as palpable as the incense that perfumed the royal apartments. In the midst of this elaborate display stood a child whose own body betrayed the truth that everyone tried to ignore. Philip tired quickly, often falling asleep in the middle of ceremonies meant to honor him. His steps were unsteady, his breathing shallow. Fever struck without warning, leaving him limp and unresponsive. Some days he seemed alert and bright, his eyes following movement with curiosity. Other days he drifted into spells of exhaustion that frightened even the most stoic attendants. Physicians argued quietly over remedies, but none could halt the slow, inevitable waning of his strength. For Philip IV and Queen Mariana, each moment with their son was both blessing and torment. The king, aged and weary, watched the boy with a devotion that bordered on desperation. He saw in Philip not only a child, but the last chance to preserve the Habsburg inheritance. Mariana, younger but burdened by grief from the loss of earlier children, clung to hope with a fierceness sharpened by fear. She surrounded her son with relics of saints, sprinkled holy water across his cradle as Philip's health faltered and rebounded in fragile cycles. Spain continued to weave its rituals around him. When he managed to sit upright for portraits, artists disguised the strain in his posture with soft shadows and flattering angles. In their paintings, the prince appeared serene, almost ethereal, his large dark eyes reflecting quiet intelligence. Yet not even the most skilled painters could erase the deeper truth. His body had become the battleground on which history wrote its warnings. Physicians whispered diagnoses behind closed doors: hydrocephalus, chronic respiratory weakness, developmental delays. Terms softened for the king's ears, but exchanged frankly among those who treated the child daily. Outside the palace, Spain teetered on the edge of crisis. Wars drained the treasury, plagues thinned populations, rebellion simmered in distant territories. But all these threats paled beside the one that lay in Philip's nursery. Foreign ambassadors wrote coded letters home, speculating on succession, partition, and political collapse. Rival powers watched Madrid closely, waiting for signs of weakness. The court responded with increased vigilance. The prince's rooms were heated, even in summer, as drafts were considered dangerous. Food tasters, confessors, and nurses rotated in constant shifts. Doors were guarded, windows bolted, and physicians summoned at the slightest cough. Nothing was left to chance, but chance was precisely the force that governed Philip's existence. And then, in the winter of 1660, hope flickered again. Despite bouts of illness, Philip managed to participate in small ceremonies, seated beside his father on a velvet dais. His face, though pale, carried a hint of rosy warmth. His breathing seemed steadier. His smile appeared briefly during a musical performance arranged for him. Couriers whispered that a miracle might be unfolding, that prayer had finally triumphed over frailty. Ministers dared speak of plans for his future reign, imagining a world where the boy would grow strong enough to inherit the crown. But this fragile improvement was only the calm before a storm. As spring approached, Philip's health began to fail more sharply. His fevers returned with greater ferocity. His appetite diminished. His moments of clarity grew shorter, replaced by stretches of lethargy that alarmed even the attendants accustomed to his fragility. The amulets above his bed multiplied. Offerings from nobles and clergy, desperate to shield him from the unseen forces they blamed for his declining strength. Holy processions filled Madrid's streets, prayers echoing through the city's churches, voices pleading for the life of a prince who could barely cling to consciousness. Physicians administered tonics and purgatives, bled him in hopes of balancing his humors, and burned incense to cleanse the air. None of it worked. His breaths came in shallow waves, separated by frightening pauses. His eyes, once bright even in illness, dulled. His limbs trembled uncontrollably. Every symptom amplified the panic, rippling through the court. Queen Mariana refused to leave his side. draped in black silken veils. She knelt for hours at his bedside, her fingers clutching rosaries until her knuckles blanched. Philip IV, aged by grief and years of ruling a fractured empire, stood silently behind her, his once commanding presence reduced to a shadow. Ministers hovered nearby, powerless. Even the most cynical courtiers softened at the sight of the small body struggling beneath embroidered blankets. By early 1661, whispers spread that Philip was unlikely to survive much longer. Spain braced itself. Church bells rang for endless masses. Nobles sent offerings to shrines as if bargaining with heaven. Still, decline pressed forward with merciless steadiness. Philip's final days were a blur of candlelight, whispered prayers, and desperate hopes. His body, weakened beyond recovery, seemed to withdraw from the world hour by hour. And then, one quiet day in early November 1661, the vigil broke. The boy who had borne an empire's hope exhaled for the last time, leaving behind a silence deeper than grief. Philip of Austria, Prince of the Asturias, was gone at the age of 4. When the news of Philip of Austria's death spread through the corridors of the Alcazar, the palace seemed to fold in on itself. Servants stopped in mid-step. Courtiers froze as though struck by invisible blows, and the atmosphere thickened into a kind of suffocating stillness. The bells of Madrid tolled low and heavy, their echoes rolling across the city like distant thunder. Spain had lost more than a child. It had lost its last clear hope. Inside the royal apartments, Queen Mariana knelt beside the small, motionless form laid upon embroidered cushions. Her hands trembled as she touched the boy's hair, her whispered prayers dissolving into the linen folds around him. Philip IV stood nearby, his face carved into a mask of disbelief. He had endured war, rebellion, and political humiliation. But this moment hollowed him in a way nothing else had. The court descended into ceremonial mourning. Black draperies veiled the palace walls, candles flickered through endless vigils, and ministers moved as though in a dream. Every gesture reflected the enormity of the loss. Throughout Europe, ambassadors wrote dispatches with a new urgency. The Spanish succession, already a source of speculation, had become an open wound. The death of the prince reshuffled alliances and reopened old ambitions. Behind closed doors, maps were unfurled, borders imagined, futures carved from Spain's potential collapse. Inside Spain, the impact was even more profound. Churches overflowed with citizens praying for the soul of the small prince, whose death seemed to signal divine displeasure. But beneath the religious rituals lay a quieter, more unsettling fear. The recognition that the monarchy's stability had been shattered. Within the palace, Philip's chamber remained untouched for days. Everything felt suspended as though the child might return and inhabit it all once more. But no amount of ritual or prayer could bring life back into the space. When the time came to prepare his body for burial, the court's grief deepened into something like awe. Philip's features, often contorted in illness during life, now appeared softened by stillness. His pale skin glowed faintly under candlelight, the heavy Habsburg jaw less pronounced in death. Attendants dressed him in robes of white silk, embroidered with gold threads, symbols of innocence and royal dignity. He was carried through the palace on a bier so small that even seasoned courtiers wept as it passed. The funeral procession wound slowly through Madrid, accompanied by thousands of mourners who fell silent as the coffin passed. The streets were lined with citizens who crossed themselves, bowed their heads or whispered prayers. The grief was genuine, but so was the fear. The unspoken knowledge that Spain's dynasty had been dealt a blow from which it might never recover. At El Escorial, the vast granite mausoleum of Spanish kings, the burial was carried out with solemn grandeur. The monks led the procession into the Pantheon, where generations of Habsburgs lay behind marble slabs carved with their names, titles, and symbols of power. Here, among ancestors whose faces appeared in countless portraits, jaws heavy, eyes drooping, features distorted by the very bloodline they had preserved. Philip of Austria was laid to rest. When the ceremony ended, the court walked out of the mausoleum into a world forever changed. Philip IV returned to his throne, but his steps seemed slower, his breath heavier. Queen Mariana withdrew deeper into prayer and ritual, her grief sharpening her already fierce sense of duty. Ministers convened emergency councils. The question of succession became a topic whispered through corridors where once only hope had circulated. Even the walls seemed to absorb the grief. And yet, despite the overwhelming sorrow, the machinery of monarchy continued to turn. Life at court resumed in measured steps. But everything felt changed, as if the death of one small boy had shifted the very axis upon which Spain revolved. Because in truth it had. Philip of Austria, frail and tender, had carried the crown's future on his narrow shoulders. His death did more than break the hearts of his parents. It broke the fragile balance sustaining a dynasty, exposed the cracks in the foundations of empire, and revealed the consequences of centuries of choices made in the name of power. In the weeks following Philip of Austria's burial, the Alcazar became a battlefield of whispers. Ministers who had once stood united in public now huddled in private corners, exchanging glances heavy with calculation. Queen Mariana, still shrouded in mourning veils, retreated deeper into the rituals of grief. But her grief did not weaken her resolve. If anything, it sharpened it. She saw clearly that with Philip gone, Spain teetered closer to catastrophe. Her remaining son, the infant Charles, was frail beyond measure, a child whose future was clouded by uncertainty from his first breath. Philip IV, however, aged visibly in the aftermath. His shoulders drooped, his gaze turned inward, and his capacity for decisive governance waned. The loss of his long-awaited son had hollowed him in ways that even war and grief had never achieved. He leaned increasingly on Mariana for matters of state, granting her influence that many grandees resented. Among those who watched the shifting dynamics was Don Juan of Austria the Younger, the king's illegitimate son, charismatic, ambitious, and already a celebrated military leader. He sensed the fragility of the monarchy like a predator sensing weakness. To him, Philip's death removed a future rival and exposed the path toward power. He began to position himself as the defender of Spanish interests. Rumors multiplied. The court fractured into factions, those loyal to Mariana, those loyal to Don Juan, and those who waited in silence for the winds to shift. Don Juan of Austria sharpened his political instincts. He watched the queen with suspicion, interpreting her increasing authority as a threat to Spain's autonomy. Crowds in Madrid, frustrated with ongoing hardship, began to chant his name during festivals and gatherings. To them, he represented vigor, Spanish pride, and escape from the suffocating grip of palace intrigue. Mariana recognized the danger immediately. She strengthened her alliances within the council, elevated loyal advisors, and attempted to curb Don Juan's influence. But the seeds of conflict had already been sown. Through all of this, the memory of Philip of Austria lingered like a specter. The Habsburg dynasty, already weakened, now faced its most perilous chapter, an empire vast but crumbling. Philip of Austria had carried Spain's hopes for 4 brief years. In his death, those hopes did not disappear. They fractured, multiplied, and transformed into battles that would shape the future of Europe. Don Juan of Austria continued to cultivate influence among discontented nobles. They saw opportunity in the fragility of Charles, in the king's declining health. Mariana, aware of every whispered accusation, did not bend. She fortified her alliances. As Charles grew older, physicians scrutinized every sign of improvement or decline. Letters sent to Paris, Vienna, and London described him as delicate, slow to develop, plagued by ailments. By the early 1660s, the Spanish monarchy felt stretched thin, like a tapestry frayed at the edges, but still clinging to its frame. Spain remained powerful, yes, but not invincible. And at the center of it all, there remained a memory. A small boy, pale and trembling, who had once been paraded through these same chambers as the future of an empire. His presence had been delicate, his life brief, but the echo of his existence continued to mold the fate of nations. His brief life had revealed the limits of royal blood and the consequences of choices made centuries before his birth. Spain would endure, but transformed, forced into paths it had never intended to walk. And though history would remember kings, queens, generals, and treaties, the quiet truth lingered in the shadows. The destiny of an empire had once depended on a child who lived only 4 years. Philip of Austria, fragile and fleeting, had shaped the future simply by leaving.